wanted to start off the discussion with a quote from when I became a CEO at an age of 31 years old, and my first board member was this guy, Masaichi-san. And it's funny, we spent some time when I first went there. My first board meeting was in Japan, and we went up, and Masaichi-san took us to his house, and he actually had a golf simulator. This is in 2001, so you know how far advanced this guy was. And he talked about artificial intelligence then. And I was like, forget it. Now I realize how smart this guy was, a brilliant guy. And one of the things that I've read quite a bit about how he looks at AI, and one of the things that he's talking about is the impact of what AI is going to have to us across digital infrastructure. And if you watch what SoftBank is doing, they're all in on this, and their belief that it's going to happen. And the reality is artificial intelligence will drive everything that we're doing in this room, and most of the digital infrastructure around the world is going to be impacted by this over the next couple of years. What's the reason for this? If you look at the chipsets, and I was a computer guy when I started out. I was a PC salesman in New York, and back then chips would actually change about every 4 to 5 months. And you go from the 286, some of you guys that are as old as I would remember the 286 and the 386 and the 486. The reality is we're in a different place. Moore's law is out the door. We're in a place right now that's completely different than anything we've ever seen in the computer industry. And it's changing not only the computer industry, but the software industry, the power industry, and all of digital infrastructure. And it's largely happened in the last 18 months. That's the good news. The challenging news is if you start studying what's going on in the world today, and you start talking to the Wall Street guys, we're at the edge of what could be a correction. And many people think that that correction's coming very, very soon. And they've been saying this for the last 18 months when you talk to CEOs, CFOs. So even though we've got this plank of growth that we're seeing across the economies, there's also a lot of warning signs. There's a lot of red beacons going off with Wall Street about what possibly could happen over the next few months. So today, what we're going to do is spend some time on AI-driven infrastructure, probably the biggest topic that we're talking about, and it's actually been driving most of the stock markets, and it probably drives everything that we're all talking about. Everyone that's here in this room is dealing with these issues today, and we will be dealing with these issues for the next 5 to 10 years. There's also a series of market dynamics, and I was fortunate to go to Japan in June this year, and there's an economist with a group called JETRO who made a fantastic presentation in Japanese, but he talked about the virtuous cycle and actually how Japan is trying to get out of this funk that many people would actually say the United States is in the same place, and Eastern and Western Europe is in the same place. And it was a very, very interesting discussion. So we'll spend a little bit of time on how the Japanese are looking at this and how they're looking at the digital economy. Then there's obviously the geopolitical chessboard. Obviously, here in Washington, D.C., unless you're asleep or under a rock, you've probably noticed there's been stuff going on with tariffs, things going on between China and the United States. There's quite a bit of things going on that are actually having a dramatic impact on our industry. One of the other things that I want to talk about, and it's important, is the security of digital infrastructure. One of the things that's actually happened also is as we've kind of focused on these bigger and bigger projects, we've actually become very unsecure in certain places around the world. And if we don't secure those locations or don't start thinking about what we're going to do in those locations, we could be in a very, very difficult place. And there are places where there are choke points inside our digital infrastructure that you could essentially take down large portions of the global internet in one go. And these are worrying factors. Finally, we'll spend some time on AI's future and where we see it going forward, and then hand it over to probably one of the greatest groups of speakers we've had in a very, very long time. And I'm very, very excited about the group that we've got, and we'll walk you through sort of the agenda that we have for the rest of the day. So if you look at it, this is one of the things that everyone's talking about. This is, if you look at it, China today is in the lead in many factors in terms of AI, except for training models. We have 6 main training models here in the United States. The Chinese have 1. But the reality is if you start looking at the main things that drive the future, the Chinese have more power. They're putting in more nuclear power plants. They're actually going to have a lot more power than we will over time. We don't even have the power. If we actually used all of the power in the United States and you followed where we're going with AI, we may not even have enough if we just use that power to deal with AI. And yet the Chinese are going to have a huge overhead. So this is a big factor that we've got to think about. One of the other things that's interesting, and this is a slide that the folks in Japan talked us through, which was the impact on these economies. And one of the things that you're seeing is there are trillions of dollars of impact that's going to come from AI, and it's not going to happen just in the next 6 months. It's going to happen in the next 3-4 years, but you're going to see huge impact. And some people would actually say, if you look at, and I'll get to a slide a little bit later, but you talk about the U.S. economy right now. If you took out the AI effect, we've actually been close to a recession in the United States. That's actually, if you look at just the CapEx budgets being spent by the large hyperscalers, it's actually driven us into growth. But the reality is the United States wouldn't be growing if we actually didn't have a lot of this AI stuff going on. Reality is we are going to have we will see an uplift across many different parts of the economy. And I think it's going to be a very, very exciting time. And it's a place, there's a reason why Google, Facebook, Microsoft are all putting tons of money in there. Reality is this is going to be a big, big driver of the future. Sundar, very, very smart guy, and I love to quote him. And this is one of his best quotes. And he says, AI has the ability to be more transformative than electricity or fire. And obviously it's a bit of a sensational quote, but it also puts you in perspective where he sees things. And I think for Google, it actually is there. For Google, this is probably one of the most important things that they have to focus on as a company going forward. One of the things, obviously, there has been, people may not say there's been turbulence. I would say there's been turbulence here in the United States over the last 6 months. If you don't see that, I think you're under a rock. But the reality is, despite all of the challenges, trade changes, we actually have seen tremendous growth, and we're seeing tremendous growth. And AI is continuing to grow, cloud's continuing to grow. We're seeing projects go forwards. There's been tariffs coming in, tariffs going out. But the reality is it hasn't stopped this train. This train continues to go. And I think that's one of the things that's very interesting. Well, you'll hear from a lot of our experts that a lot of the demand areas that we thought were actually going to be impacted by the global economy and a lot of the changes with trade have not impacted. We've actually seen acceleration going forward. One of the other interesting things, though, is as we start thinking about digital infrastructure, many of the private equity folks and data centers companies, and also just telcos, we focused on a very, very discrete set of services over the last 10 years. And it was a very, very simple, fairly simple model. We would build data centers. They'd be filled over 3 to 5 years. We'd finance them, and then we'd roll it in and we'd build another one. Private equity would actually fund this. They would actually get some debt, and this virtuous cycle would continue. Reality is we're heading into a different place. Where we're going is a place where the technology has a much shorter cycle. So instead of being a 10-year continuum, we're into a 2 to 3 year continuum. If you look at the average GPU, it's changed. And it's been changing every 12 to 18 months. And that's going to actually have an impact on how we actually build data centers and digital infrastructure. The other challenge is most of these servers that we had for the last 20 years were cooled by air. For the next 20 years, most of these servers are going to be cooled by something else. It's either going to be water or it's going to be some sort of liquid cooling. And so we're moving into most of our data centers today around the world actually do air cooling. And so there's going to be a change, the first time a major change in technology in the data center area. And that's also going to have an impact on scale as well. So one of the things is not only are these larger data centers, but the scale at which the infrastructure, if you think about it, if we were in this conference 3 years ago, everyone would be talking about 5 and 10 megawatt deals, 15 megawatt deals. Now they're talking about 200 megawatt deals or gigawatt deals. And so we're at a place that's exponentially larger, and it's with completely new technology. And so when you start thinking about, is it the data center guys of yesterday, are they going to be the guys of tomorrow? And it was interesting, I had a breakfast with Andy Power this morning, and he was talking about the fact that maybe some of these data centers aren't even data centers. They're just big supercomputers. And that'll be one of the things I think that we could talk about in some of these sessions is, are we actually moving to a world where we're just building supercomputers? With that in mind, there's a lot of, and this is actually a great slide. This shows you in 2025 what people are spending, and this is the CapEx budget. And if you get a chance, there's Jonathan Aiken from RBS puts out a report, usually about this time every year, and it actually goes through the capital budget of all the hyperscalers. And this is one of the interesting stats to look at is how much are they actually spending? Because this is a sign of where things are going, and also a very, very good indicator for everyone that actually is studying this part of the economy. Reality is they're spending more money. The tech giants, have actually increased their CapEx budgets substantially in the last 2 years, and it looks like it'll accelerate into 2026. One of the other things that's interesting, though, is this is the 10 largest data center companies in the world. Now, if you listen to the deal that was actually announced by Trump when he was in the Middle East, that deal would actually position whatever company that's called at the end of the day, that would actually fit on this map as the third largest data center company in the world in one deal. And that just shows you the size of these new deals that are coming right now today. Essentially, if you look at DRT, they actually run a little bit less than 3 gigawatts of power. There are actually campuses that they're envisioning there'll be 1 to 2 to 3 gigawatts of power. So you can actually have campuses bigger than all of DRT in one go, which is pretty amazing. And you think about it, because DRT has built this portfolio over the course of 20 years. And the reality is in 3 to 5 years, you may have multiple players that are bigger than DRT. Now, it doesn't mean that DRT won't grow to that size too. DRT's got a beautiful backlog and capability to probably go to 8. So I think the reality is they have the ability to grow. But if you look at this map today, you could actually have a bunch of new players as soon as next year. Now, if you think about it, a lot of these signals that we're seeing, and this is why it scares the hell out of me at times. If you look at all these down points, those are actually the precursors to large recessions or large market corrections. We're in one of those things right now. If you look at the AI bubble and you compare it to what happened in 2001, there's a ton of similarities. And so even though we've got all this demand coming, we're spending all this money, we're putting CapEx in, and the difference, I think, that's very different in this cycle, and the reason why people will say this is different, is that the 5 companies that are investing are the most profitable and largest companies in the world. If you looked at 2000, it was a bunch of companies with large market caps, but not real businesses. And so I think there is a difference between where we are now and where we were in 2000, and that's a reason why I think there is reason to believe that we actually can survive this, and it won't be a massive correction necessarily. This is the virtuous cycle that, and this is a great slide because I think it talks about what governments should do. And this is the Japanese blueprint for how the Japanese believe they should get out of a cycle. And one of the problems is, as you know, in Japan, they got into essentially a 15-year cycle where they were essentially going backwards. They were in a recession almost constantly, or there was flat growth. They had deflation. So just all of the challenging parts of the economy. And one of the issues was, it really came back to the mood of the businesses and how businesses attacked the markets. And one of the things that was interesting when I listened to the speech, it was fantastic. He was saying you have to build from the bottom up. You've got to actually build talent, you've got to build the resources, and you've got to have the right mentality to think about growth. And one of the things that the Japanese would focus on, and I think it's what we're all going to have to focus on as we go through this, is how do we bring all the elements in our economies into this? And one of the things, the reason why this is a great discussion with government is how does AI actually bring the middle of America or the lower classes of America into this new industrial revolution that's happening? And I think one of the challenges, Japan is trying to solve this problem right now, and I think America will be trying to solve this over the next few decades. Let's talk about the geopolitical chessboard. This is always a fun topic. I call it Belt and Road versus Friends of America. This is, and when I say Friends of America, it seems to be, right now we tend to go to different places where we're friends, and we actually have established, if you look at where we've built infrastructure so far, it's been in sort of friendly locations. One of the issues, and the reason for a lot of this geopolitical unrest from our perspective in the tech industry has largely been because of trade issues with China. And if you look at it, if you look at China's deficit with us, it's bigger than any other, all the other countries combined. And reality is it is a relationship that had to be addressed, but it actually affects us in the tech industry. If you look at around the world, there's something like 220 countries that have built digital infrastructure. If you look at it, there's about 114 of them that are dominated by Chinese technology, where they've actually even built their towers, their fiber. They've built, essentially all of their digital infrastructure with Chinese technology. And so the reality is, we're here to stay. It's going to be, there's going to be two countries that are going to be involved in this, whether we like it or not. And a lot of the emerging markets, they will not be able to change infrastructure. They are stuck where they are, and they've actually built with Chinese infrastructure, even though the Americans have tried to help as much as they can. So there will be areas that will impact us going forward. The other thing is the United States is highly dependent on Asia for chips. If you look at it today, we can actually go out and actually manufacture all of our own chips. We actually are so dependent on Taiwan and China today to actually manufacture in this key area. So I think if you look at our business model today as a country, we still have some issues to solve. And one of them is obviously the chips and power are the two things that I think you'll hear when you see people up here talking. It'll be about those topics. And this just gives you some idea of where where China is. China right now has invested in nuclear power in a way that no one actually ever could have believed possible. They're actually building 20 nuclear power plants. Each one of these are capable of 3 gigawatts to 5 gigawatts of power. They've already surpassed the United States, and they're almost to a point where they'll actually have more power than the United States plus Western Europe combined. And so if you look at it, they have the capability right now to run massive powered data centers and actually play in the AI game. The only thing they're missing is they have one training model at the end of the day, and they're sort of working through that. But the reality is, if you look at the key components, they've got the silicon and they've got the power. So the United States is in somewhat of a second position when it comes to this going forward. And this just gives you some idea on the U.S. electricity. And one of the challenges also in the United States right now is most of the power coming in the last 4 years was actually green power. And a lot of that green power has been shelved. And as we've shelved it, the deficit that we have in the United States to get to close to China can only be done by going in the direction of nuclear power. But the reality is we can't bring nuclear power on fast enough to do this. And the average nuclear power plant takes something like 10 years from day one to actually build it. So the reality is we're not going to get there for a very, very long time. We're talking 10 to 20 years before the United States could actually compete, unless there's some sort of fundamental shift in how we actually do things in the United States. The challenge is, and one of the things that I think is, for everyone in this room, the United States and China are decoupling. Our dependence on China will be very different, but the reality is it will still be there. And one of the things is how do we as American companies or Western companies try and deal with it? Obviously, we're going to have to work with a lot of the regulations. We're going to be dodging a lot of different things between the governments, between the next, there'll be reactions from America, China, and these will actually impact a lot of how we operate our companies. Because if you look at it, you could talk to any one of the companies here, almost 100% at some point have got components either in one of their subsidiaries or somewhere overseas that's manufactured by the Chinese, whether it be servers, whether it be a deployment with Huawei, or you name it. There's stuff that's going on that are difficult to deal with. And I think one of the things is we have to embrace it. It can't be just this black box. We've got to say, all right, how do we deal with these things? And how do we deal with government to make it possible that we can actually navigate through what is a very, very difficult situation? And it will impact digital infrastructure for a long time. One of the other things that's important, and this is becoming probably one of the most important areas of focus, and I started in the submarine cable space, and it was a quiet little spot for a long time. It's coming back. When you start thinking about AI and where you've actually got to build infrastructure, most of the locations where you've got electricity, you don't have fiber. And so the reality is there's going to have to be a lot of new fiber built to a lot of different new places. And so it's going to be a different strategy. So submarine cables typically chased population centers. So if you look at it, we were always building to the largest population centers and then connecting them back to the United States or to Western Europe and connecting the internet. The big networks that need to be built in the future are going to be to locations where you can get 3, 5, 10, 15 gigawatts of power and bring that on stream to actually build AI models. And so you're going to need this infrastructure. And today, it doesn't exist. And so in many of these places around the world, we're going to actually have to build new cables. And it's a very different business model as well, because you have to look at it. You don't have demand necessarily. You're actually having to build in advance of demand. And so there's going to be some stuff that's going to have to be done, a lot of work in terms of thinking it through. One of the big challenges, and this just shows you where, if you look at the large locations where there's excess power, this is the map. Now the good news is the East Coast of the United States, Western Europe are very big power locations. But then you start seeing there's locations in Latin America, for example, Brazil. We have some representatives from Brazil who's got a lot of excess power. Not a lot of network there, okay? You've got parts of Africa that have a lot of excess power, not a lot of network there. And then you start looking, Australia sits on a ton of power, but it's one of the most difficult places to build a network to because it's at a very, very far end of the earth. So cables are expensive there. So the reality is there's some new places that are very, very important from a power perspective that we're gonna have to start thinking about this digital infrastructure and how we build it there. And one of the things the good news is we can do it with cables that are cheaper, faster. A lot of this is thanks to Google, Microsoft, and a lot of the players. entering into the optical space and doing a lot of research. If you look at submarine cables, you know, the vintage ones of 2000, we would build essentially a cable across the Atlantic for almost $1 billion, okay? And that would carry maybe 4 terabits of capacity if we were lucky. Now, we build that same cable across the Atlantic for about $200 million, and it will have 12 fiber players, which will each carry 20 terabits of capacity and could actually go up to as much as 40 terabits. So just to give you some idea, that's in 20 years how much the technology has changed. And that's what's happened with, thanks to a lot of the investment that's happened in this infrastructure. So the good news is we've got to get cables to new places. We will be able to do it, and we'll actually be able to do it fairly cheaply. And the interesting thing is that submarine cables used to be the drivers for a lot of infrastructure. When you start looking at an AI data center, the submarine cable or the fiber is now a rounding error, okay? It's when you're building a center that's going to cost $20 billion, $100 million of submarine cable is irrelevant. And so the reality is, this is going to be something that we're going to see a lot of, but it's also going to be sort of one of those things that you just do. It's going to be part of the infrastructure. Okay, we got to get some servers, we got to get this fiber in there, boom, done. And it's going to be a small number, which is interesting because it used to be one of the key things. These are big projects where the prime ministers would all sit there and, you know, cut the ribbon and stuff, and this is now going to be something that, we got to do a data center over there, we'll build a submarine cable. So it's going to be a different world. And this just shows you, if you look at it, we spent, and this is just an interesting example, $11 billion, it was $43 billion were spent in 1998 and 2001 to build a bunch of infrastructure that now essentially can be carried on 2 to 3 fiber pairs. So you think about $43 billion, and now you're doing it with 3 fiber pairs. You can almost do the exact same thing. So it's absolutely amazing how far the technology's come. So the reality is that this is, while it's a problem, it's something that can be fixed well within our means to do that. The other interesting thing is it's not necessarily Americans that are building these anymore. So as I speak here to the US government and many of the folks here, it's actually the French, the Chinese, and the Japanese that are actually building most of these cables. Although Subcom is probably one of the biggest contractors, the manufacturers are largely offshore. So if you think about it, in our digital infrastructure today, most of that technology is actually coming from non-US vendors. One of the other key things is also there's 2 main choke points that we got to think about. And you'll actually hear that if you think about most of the submarine cables before the 2020s were largely built into either Hong Kong, Taiwan, or in that corridor. That corridor has become off limits, and there's actually been a lot of issues with that. And so there's actually been a complete shift to places like Guam that were never important on the map. And this just goes to show that how geopolitics can impact and actually create huge markets in places that never existed before. And I think one of the things that you'll see is like the South China Sea used to be the most important place to bring cables in. And now it's actually a no-go zone. And so if you look at it, you got 20 years of investment going into one place that now actually has to be shifted. So not only do you have new stuff coming with AI, but actually geopolitics is going to drive it. The Middle East, you actually have Mohammed here who's going to talk from Telecom Egypt, probably one of the most difficult places to navigate. If you think about, and the reason that we always like to talk about the Middle East is because for Asians, this is an Asian conference, to get to Europe, you actually have to cross through here. You have to go through Egypt. You have to go through Muhammad to get there. And the reality is, this is a part of the world that has had a lot of volatility. And it's actually a very, very important pinch point in the internet going forward. And it will be for the next few decades. There's no choice. Any cable that comes from Asia that wants to go to Europe has to somehow get through the Middle East. This is something I'm going to leave for a lot of the experts to talk about, but I think it's a slide that I actually used, and it's funny. The last PTC was during inauguration, and it was right as, and I used this slide to lead into it. It was the end of the world as we know it. And to be honest with you, I couldn't have been more right about the world changing from PTC. And this is January 15th. I feel like 5 years has gone since we actually had that discussion. But the reality is, where AI has gone is a very, very, we're in a great spot, but it's going to be even amazing, much more amazing. If you look at it, this is just, if you look at where we are today in 2025, you essentially have AI at a point where it's, essentially the models are about as smart as your college student. You know, if you think about it, you got a bunch of college kids now that are around they're essentially computers. They're going to go to Einstein, and then they're going to go past Einstein, and they're going to do that in the next 3 years. So this little AI model that we think of and is going to a different place. And then it's interesting when you start thinking about, and this is where Vint and these guys will talk about it a lot more, is when you get to agents, and agents then work together. You start to see that not only, there's a geometric multiplier that actually happens when models actually work together. And you're going to see that even changes things more. And so it's going to be fascinating. I mean, where we are going to be in 2030 is going to be mind-blowing. And it's going to be a very exciting place. And I can't define what it's going to look like, but I can tell you something. There's going to be a lot of compute power and a lot of things being done that we never thought were going to be capable of being done, whether it be in biotech, whether it be in financial services, whether it be in technology. Reality is it's going to touch every aspect of our lives, and it will change our lives. I think AI it's interesting when you read what people have to say, there's a lot of caution, and there's caution for very smart people, all right? So Musk has got his views. You've got Bill Gates giving you his view, and Stephen Hawking, saying, oh, this is a really dangerous thing. It could change the whole human race. Reality is, it's probably more like where these guys are, which is we're going to use it as a tool. And I think we have to learn it as a tool. And the IBM's former CEO had a great way of saying, he said, AI will not replace humans, but those who use AI will replace those who don't. And I think that's one of the interesting quotes is how that's going to impact us all going forward. Because I think it's more important that we engage it and realize it's part of it, but it shouldn't be seen as a threat. Thank you.